Daniel, this section's for immediate family only. My aunt snapped, pointing toward a shaky chair by the exit. Several relatives laughed. Then the staff brought over the $3,100 bill and set it in front of me. I smiled, stood up, and announced, "Good thing I'm not family, then I don't need to pay." I, 29M, never expected my grandfather's funeral to become the moment I finally understood where I truly stood in my family. But sometimes clarity comes in the most brutal ways. The chapel was packed when I arrived, dressed in my best black suit that I'd bought specifically for this day. Grandpa Joe had been more than family to me. He'd been my mentor, my confidant, and honestly, the only person in our extended family who'd ever treated me like I mattered. When Mom died in a car accident when I was 12, Grandpa stepped in without hesitation. Dad had already walked out on us 3 years earlier, so it was just me and the old man against the world. I walked toward the front rows where the immediate family was gathering, expecting to sit with everyone else. That's when my aunt intercepted me like a security guard at a nightclub. She looked me up and down with that familiar expression of disdain I'd grown accustomed to over the years, then delivered her verdict with surgical precision. This section was for immediate family only, she informed me curtly, pointing toward a wobbly plastic chair positioned near the exit like some kind of afterthought. The message was crystal clear: I didn't belong. Several relatives nearby actually laughed. Not nervous chuckles or uncomfortable throat clearing, but genuine amusement at my apparent presumption. My cousin smirked and made some comment about knowing my place. Another relative muttered something about respect and boundaries that sent more ripples of laughter through the group. I felt the familiar burn of humiliation creep up my neck, but I walked to that shaky chair by the exit without saying a word. From my banished position, I watched the service unfold like an outsider looking through a window. They shared stories about Grandpa, painted him as this beloved patriarch, talked about family bonds and legacy. Not once did anyone mention the grandson he'd raised for 6 years after tragedy struck. Not once did they acknowledge that I'd been the one visiting him twice a week at the nursing home for the past 3 years while they were all too busy with their important lives. What they didn't know, what none of them had bothered to ask about, was the conversation Grandpa and I had 6 months before he passed. He'd been sharp as ever that day, sitting in his favorite chair by the window, when he brought up something that had been weighing on his mind. He'd been thinking about the funeral arrangements, he told me, and how expensive everything was getting. He'd done some research and gotten quotes from several funeral homes. The one the family preferred was going to cost over $3,000, and he was worried about who would handle the financial burden. I assured him immediately that money wouldn't be an issue. I'd been saving specifically for this possibility, knowing his health was declining. More importantly, I wanted him to have the dignity and respect he deserved when his time came. He seemed relieved, and we spent the rest of that visit talking about his childhood stories and his hopes for my future. 2 weeks later, he called me specifically to discuss the arrangements again. He wanted to make sure I understood exactly what I was taking on, and he wanted to be certain this was something I was doing out of love, not obligation. I assured him it was absolutely out of love. He'd given me everything when I had nothing, and this was the least I could do in return. The funeral director had been expecting me. Grandpa had made sure to put my name on all the paperwork as the financial responsible party. I'd written the check without hesitation, knowing it would give him the send-off he deserved. After the service, everyone gathered in the reception area of the funeral home. The mood had shifted from somber to almost celebratory as relatives caught up with each other, shared memories, and talked about family plans. I remained in my corner, still the outsider, watching the family dynamics play out like some twisted theater performance. That's when the funeral director approached our group with a clipboard and an apologetic expression. There was the matter of the final payment, he explained professionally. The total came to $3,100, and he needed to settle the account before everyone left. My aunt immediately assumed the role of family spokesperson, as she always did. She started looking around the group, clearly expecting someone else to step forward. My uncle began reaching for his wallet reluctantly. Other relatives suddenly became very interested in their phones or the floral arrangements. The funeral director set the bill directly in front of me. That's when everything became perfectly clear. I looked at that invoice, then looked around at all the faces that had spent the day treating me like an unwelcome stranger. The same people who'd laughed when I was banished to the back. The same people who'd acted like I had no right to mourn the man who'd raised me. The same people who'd never once acknowledged what Grandpa meant to me or what I'd meant to him. I smiled, probably the first genuine smile I'd managed all day, and stood up slowly. Every eye in the room was on me now, and I could feel the shift in energy as they realized something was happening. I announced clearly that this was actually perfect timing. Since I'd been made very clear that I wasn't considered immediate family, I obviously had no responsibility for family expenses. They'd wanted to exclude me from the family section, so they could certainly handle the family obligations without me as well. The silence that followed was deafening. You could practically hear the gears turning in their heads as they processed what I'd just said. My aunt's face went through several shades of red before settling on a purple that probably wasn't healthy. My uncle's hand froze halfway to his wallet. The funeral director maintained his professional composure, but I caught a tiny smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Then the questions started flying. What did I mean I wasn't paying? How could I do this at Grandpa's funeral? What kind of person walks away from family responsibility like this? I explained calmly that I wasn't walking away from anything. They'd walked away from me. I'd simply been following their lead all day. They'd made their position on my family status abundantly clear, and I was just respecting their wishes. My aunt demanded to know how I could be so cruel and selfish. I reminded her about the chair by the exit and asked if she remembered finding my exclusion amusing just a few hours earlier. I pointed out that this was exactly the outcome she'd orchestrated. She'd gotten exactly what she wanted. The funeral director cleared his throat gently and mentioned that he did need to settle the account before the facility closed. Someone would need to handle the payment situation soon. That's when the real panic set in. They started looking at each other with growing alarm as the reality of a $3,100 bill hit home. None of them had come prepared to cover that kind of expense. They'd all assumed someone else would handle it, or that it had already been taken care of. My uncle asked if they could set up a payment plan. The funeral director explained that payment was expected in full before the conclusion of services. My cousin suggested everyone could chip in, but when they started trying to collect money, it became obvious that nobody had more than a few $100s available. I watched this financial scrambling with the same detached interest they'd shown when I was being humiliated earlier. The tables had turned completely, and now they were the ones looking desperate and out of place. My aunt made one last attempt to guilt me into paying. She brought up family loyalty, Grandpa's memory, and doing the right thing. She said I was dishonoring his legacy by creating this scene. I told her she was absolutely right about dishonoring his legacy. The difference was that I'd been dishonoring it by allowing them to treat me like garbage for years while still trying to be the dutiful family member. Grandpa had raised me to stand up for myself and demand respect, and today I was finally following his lessons. The funeral director suggested they might want to step into his office to discuss options privately. As the group started filing toward the office in obvious distress, I gathered my things and headed for the door. My aunt called after me, asking where I thought I was going. I told her I was leaving, just like she'd wanted. I reminded her that she'd made it clear I didn't belong here, so I was simply respecting her wishes and removing myself from family business. As I walked toward my car, I could hear raised voices coming from the funeral home office. Through the windows, I could see them gesturing frantically and pointing in my direction. The funeral director maintained his calm professionalism while they clearly spiraled into crisis mode. Update 1. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in years. The weight of trying to earn their acceptance, of constantly proving I belonged, of swallowing their disrespect, all of it was finally gone. For the first time since Mom died, I felt like I was honoring her memory and Grandpa's lessons about self-respect. The phone calls started within an hour. First my aunt, then my uncle, then various cousins I barely spoke to. They were furious, desperate, and increasingly creative with their accusations. I was selfish, heartless, vindictive, and completely unreasonable. How could I put them in this position over hurt feelings? I listened to each voicemail with growing amusement. These were the same people who'd found it hilarious to exile me to a chair by the exit just hours earlier. Now suddenly my feelings mattered. Now suddenly I was important enough to deserve their attention. The best part was hearing them try to reframe the situation. According to their version of events, the seating arrangement had been a simple misunderstanding. The laughter had been nervous energy from grief. They'd always considered me family, and I was being overly sensitive about innocent comments. My aunt left 3 separate messages. In the first, she was angry and demanding. In the second, she tried bargaining and negotiation. By the third, she was nearly in tears, begging me to be reasonable and help them figure out this financial crisis. I didn't return any of the calls. The next morning brought a new development. My cousin showed up at my apartment at 7 a.m., looking like he hadn't slept. He'd been elected as the family spokesperson, apparently because everyone else was too proud to face me directly. He asked if we could talk about the situation like adults. I invited him in and made coffee while he launched into what was clearly a rehearsed speech about family forgiveness and moving forward together. According to him, everyone felt terrible about the misunderstanding at the funeral. They'd been so consumed with grief that they hadn't been thinking clearly. Nobody meant to hurt my feelings, and they hoped I could find it in my heart to forgive their poor judgment. I asked him directly if he was apologizing for their behavior or asking me to pay the bill. He stumbled around the question for a few minutes before admitting that the funeral home was demanding payment by the end of the week or they pursue legal action. I told him that sounded like a family problem, and since I wasn't family, it wasn't my concern. He tried a different approach, talking about what Grandpa would have wanted. Surely Grandpa wouldn't want his death to tear the family apart like this. Surely he'd want everyone to come together and support each other during this difficult time. I agreed completely. Grandpa definitely would have wanted the family to come together and support each other. He also would have wanted his grandson to be treated with dignity and respect at his funeral, but that hadn't seemed to matter to anyone yesterday. My cousin left looking defeated, promising to talk to everyone about finding another solution. I wished him luck and went back to my morning routine. Update 2. By Thursday, the situation had escalated dramatically. I started getting calls from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, people who'd never shown any interest in my life suddenly very concerned about family unity. Apparently word had spread through the extended family network, and opinions were divided. Some sided with my aunt's crew, viewing me as petty and vindictive for abandoning family during a crisis. Others, particularly the ones who'd witnessed years of me being treated as lesser family, were quietly supportive of my stand. My great-aunt called Wednesday night with the most interesting perspective yet. She'd been at the funeral and seen everything unfold. She told me she'd been waiting years for someone to finally put my aunt in her place, and she was proud of me for standing up for myself. More importantly, she shared some information that put everything in perspective. Apparently, this wasn't the first time my aunt had orchestrated family drama for her own benefit. She'd pulled similar power plays at weddings, graduations, and other family events, always positioning herself as the gatekeeper of who belonged and who didn't. My great-aunt also mentioned that several relatives had been disgusted by the seating situation at the funeral. They'd wanted to say something, but hadn't wanted to cause a scene. Hearing that validated everything I'd felt, but couldn't prove. Friday morning brought the most desperate call yet. My aunt had apparently exhausted all other options and was facing the reality of having to pay the full amount herself. The funeral home had made it clear that payment was due that day, no extensions. She'd managed to scrape together about $2,000 between various family members, but they were still over $1,000 short. Banks wouldn't approve a loan that quickly, and credit cards were maxed out from other expenses. For the first time in our conversation, she dropped the manipulation tactics and spoke honestly. She admitted they'd treated me poorly at the funeral. She acknowledged that the seating arrangement had been deliberate and cruel. She even admitted that they'd been taking me for granted for years, assuming I'd always be available to help while never fully accepting me as an equal family member. But now she was desperate, and she needed my help. Could I please consider paying the remaining balance, and they'd work on paying me back over time? I told her I appreciated the honesty, but the answer was still no. I explained that this wasn't about the money. It was about respect and consequences. They'd made their choice about my place in the family, and now they were experiencing the natural results of that choice. She asked what it would take for me to reconsider. Money? A formal apology? Some kind of family meeting to clear the air? I told her there was nothing she could offer because this wasn't a negotiation. This was me finally accepting the reality they'd been showing me for years and responding accordingly. The call ended with her crying and accusing me of destroying Grandpa's memory over pride. I reminded her that she'd had multiple opportunities to treat me with basic dignity and had chosen not to. The consequences were entirely her own making. That afternoon, I got a call from the funeral director. He wanted to let me know that the account had been settled in full. Apparently, several family members had taken out cash advances on credit cards to cover the remaining balance. He also mentioned, with obvious amusement, that it had been one of the most interesting payment situations he'd encountered in 20 years of funeral service. He assured me that my actions had been completely reasonable given the circumstances, and he hoped things worked out for everyone involved. Update 3. The aftermath has been exactly what I expected, and somehow better than I hoped. The family has essentially split into two camps: those who blame me for creating unnecessary drama, and those who think it was long overdue accountability. My aunt's immediate circle has doubled down on portraying me as the villain. According to their version of events, I manipulated an elderly man into paying for his own funeral just so I could humiliate the family in their time of grief. They've convinced themselves that I planned this entire scenario as some kind of elaborate revenge scheme. The irony is beautiful. They're so committed to avoiding responsibility for their own behavior that they've created an even more damaging narrative. Now I'm not just the excluded family member. I'm some kind of criminal mastermind who preys on dying relatives. But the other side of the family has been surprisingly supportive. My great-aunt hosted a small gathering last weekend where several relatives made it clear they'd been uncomfortable with my treatment for years. Apparently, I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. People had just been too conflict-averse to speak up. The most satisfying part has been the complete radio silence from the people who found my exclusion so amusing at the funeral. The same cousins who smirked and made comments about knowing my place haven't had a word to say since they had to drain their credit cards to clean up the mess. My aunt tried one final manipulation tactic last month. She sent me a long letter about how Grandpa would be disappointed in my behavior and how I was dishonoring his memory by holding grudges. She included photos of him and me together, trying to guilt me into feeling bad about my choices. I wrote back a single paragraph. I told her that Grandpa had raised me to stand up for myself and demand respect from people who wanted to be in my life. I was honoring his memory by finally following the lessons he'd taught me about self-worth. If she wanted to honor his memory, she could start by treating people with the dignity and kindness he'd modeled every day of his life. I never heard back. The strangest part of this whole experience has been discovering how much energy I'd been wasting on trying to earn acceptance from people who were never going to give it. For years, I'd bent over backward to prove I belonged, to show I was worthy of basic respect, to demonstrate my commitment to family bonds that were apparently one-sided. Now that I've stopped trying, I have so much more time and emotional space for the relationships that actually matter. I've reconnected with friends I'd neglected while chasing family approval. I've started dating again after years of being too emotionally drained for romance. I've even taken up hobbies I'd abandoned because I was always available for family obligations that were never reciprocated. Most importantly, I sleep better at night knowing I'm living authentically instead of constantly performing for an audience that was never going to appreciate the show anyway. Sometimes people ask if I regret my decision or if I miss being part of the family. The answer is simple. I never was part of the family in any meaningful way. I was just the convenient helper who could be counted on to show up, contribute, and accept whatever scraps of inclusion they felt like offering. Now I'm free to build relationships with people who actually want me around, who value what I bring to their lives, who treat me as an equal instead of a supplicant. It turns out that's a much better way to live. Grandpa would be proud. He spent his whole life teaching me that respect is earned through how you treat others, not demanded through guilt or obligation. He showed me what real love and acceptance look like, which made it impossible to keep accepting cheap imitations. I finally learned the lesson he'd been trying to teach me all along. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from people who don't appreciate your presence. Sometimes the healthiest choice is to stop trying to fix relationships that were broken by design. The chair by the exit turned out to be exactly where I needed to be. It just took me a while to realize I was supposed to use it to leave. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.